I am Chaobang. I wander the worlds. And this is my account of the arrival of Cesair, the first human in Ireland. And the story starts a long, long way from Ireland, here in Mervi, a city of the ancient kingdom of Kush, whose ruins stand today in the land they now call Sudan. Now, there are certain people who would have it that in ancient times in these parts, there was a man called Noah. And this Noah, they say, was building an ark in order to escape some great flood that his God was going to call because he didn't like people or something. I don't know. I gather it's famous. Anyway, it's not important. It's not important. I mean, what is important is these people might also tell you that this Noah had 3 sons. But there are other, perhaps better informed people who will tell you that he also had a 4th son, a son whose name was Bith. And apparently, if you haven't heard of Bith, it was because his name was struck from the record, because Noah didn't like him very much and thought he should die in the flood. That's not good, by the way. You know, if you're a parent, you don't do that. Yeah, it's abusive. You do that, you're going to have a very, very bad time. Yeah? So don't. Yeah? Anyway, so what happened is after Noah built his ark, he expressly forbade his son Bith from setting foot on board. Actually, it was worse than that, because this Bith also had a daughter, this wise, good girl, guilty of nothing, who was also barred by Noah from the ark just because she was Bith's daughter. It was ridiculous. Now, unfortunately for Noah, this woman was also very forthright, and she was not about to take this sitting down. Her name was Cesair. And Cesair did not find Noah's terms acceptable. She did not accept this strange God he seemed to have fallen in with, nor what appeared in her eyes to be his violent and intolerant vision for the world. So if they weren't going to allow her on board their ark, then the obvious thing to do, she decided, was to build her own. No, in fact, she realized she could do even better than that. She could build 3. And so that's exactly what she did. And while her 3 ships were under construction, Cesair consulted with an old Egyptian priest as to what to do with them. And the priest's advice was this: to seek a land free from humanity. Seek a land free from humanity. It made sense. This is good advice in general, isn't it? Just for managing. But it made perfect sense in the context too, because a land free from humankind would also, Cesair reasoned, be free from the so-called sin, which Noah's God intended to wipe off the face of the earth. And therefore it would be of no interest to his, let us say, rather extreme schemes. Genocide. And so, while Noah was still gathering up all his animals, construction on Cesair's 3 ships was completed, to a far better standard than Noah's, I might add. There's very concrete evidence. And onto these 3 ships, Cesair loaded everyone who would follow her. Now, these included, perhaps no surprise, many women, but they also included, of course, Cesair's father, Bith, her older brother, Lavra, and Cesair's own devoted companion, a man called Fintan. You may have heard of Fintan. And so, prepared like this, she and her crew set out on a voyage across the known world. And it was a remarkable journey. A remarkable journey. Yeah. So departing Merivy, one of the oldest civilizations, remembered for its great pyramids and prosperous trade networks, she left the shadow of a burgeoning Hebrew culture, where a monotheistic God taught of sin and wrath. Big beards. So her party moved through the Egyptian Empire, where she learned of writing and moral philosophy. In Babylon and Assyria, she came in contact with numbers and mathematics and great feats of engineering. In Greece, she learned of a growing philosophical movement and of gods who governed over, but who are also governed by, human emotions. The last civilization they encountered on their long voyage was that of the early Celts, where she witnessed their rituals of status and learned of their belief in the abiding oneness between humanity and the land. It was a long and treacherous journey. Along the way, they lost 2 of the 3 ships and many lives. But eventually, at long last, they sighted a land free from humankind on the horizon. Ireland. They'd arrived. The wanderers had arrived, and they had learnt much about the known world along the way, but the price they had paid was dear. Only 53 of their group had survived the journey. There were 50 women, which included Cesair herself, and 3 men, Fintan, Lavra, and Bith. And all of them, this entire group, they were all exhausted and weakened. And to make matters even worse, Lavra, Cesair's brother, suffered a grievous injury upon landing. An oar cut deep into his thigh. It went in like that. It was very gruesome and horrible. And it forced him to remain bedridden, so in anguish, while they struggled to establish their first settlement. But these people, they were good at what they did. Their settlement grew. It grew peacefully. Soon you might even have started to call it prosperous. And yet, for all its successes, its founder's mind was elsewhere. Cesair wanted a sign that her journey had succeeded. She wanted proof that she and her followers had indeed escaped the flood. And supposing they had, if they had, there followed a second question. How should this initial society of theirs, with 50 women and 3 men, securely and sustainably populate this land? Yeah, they weren't in a position to be sensitive about it. Flood or no flood, Cesair decided this matter was important enough. It had to be resolved. So what she did was she called her people together. They deliberated, very pragmatically, argued through a wide range of potential strategies. And once she'd heard out all of their ideas, Cesair made her decision, and through her persuasive and charismatic leadership, she brought them all to consensus. And what they decided was this: to keep their bloodlines as diverse and robust as possible, they would divide their community into 3 parts. 3 parts. The 17 of the women chose to go south, and they took along with them Cesair's wounded brother, Lavra. 16 of the women elected to go north, taking with them Cesair's father, Bith. And the other 16 women, including Cesair herself, plus her dear companion Fintan, chose to remain in the original settlement. So 3 parts. That's 3 parts. Now we have to talk about Fintan. Wise, kind Fintan. He was always, let us say, towards the gentler end of the range represented by this group of people. As you might think, he had his reservations about this plan. For a start, would his mind and body even be up to the monumental burden that it demanded of him? 16 women, all bigger than he was. It's difficult. And on top of that, he wondered, wouldn't this be hurtful to Cesair? For you see, the pair of them had deeply loved each other for most of their lives. Their hearts were bound entirely to one another. So, he approached Cesair about this. And yet, for the good of their society's future, Cesair insisted she was quite prepared to allow Fintan to engage with any of the women in their division who wished for a child. Yeah. And Fintan, he understood her logic. And so, putting sort of the civic above the personal, he acceded to it out of his love and respect for her. Regrettably, however, his task soon became an ordeal on a whole other order of magnitude. Here's why. You see, the turbulent voyage had not been benign on old Bith, Cesair's father, up in the northern group. And after only his first involvement with one of the women in that group, his heart gave out, just like that. And so, Bith became the first human to die in Ireland. And then there was Lavra. Well, Lavra, you see, he'd never really recovered from his injury at the end of the voyage. He had become infected and all sorts of stuff. I'll spare you the detail. It's not very pretty anyway. The point is, as soon as his group had arrived in the southern lands, he too passed away. So the plan to divide up the community thus appeared in serious doubt as the women of both the northern and the southern groups returned to Cesair's original settlement, whereupon Fintan, now the only man left, suddenly felt the pressure of 49 pairs of inquiring eyes upon him. History does not record the exact circumstances of Fintan's breakdown. We might wonder, did the impact of these expectations, along with the sudden loss of both his brother-in-law and his father-in-law, both of whom were very dear to him, take its traumatic toll on Fintan's spirit? Perhaps he found himself no longer in a condition to fulfill what he felt Cesair expected of him. And yet he could not bring himself to face her and tell her, not after all her struggles on their behalf, not after all she'd done to get them that far. The outcome, in any case, is clear. Fintan vanished. Whether because he fled or got lost in a haze of suffering, he disappeared into the caves in the southwest of Ireland. And when she learnt about this, Cesair was devastated. All the accomplishments of the journey, all the achievements of the settlement she had directed, it was all impaled in her mind by the anguish of losing her beloved Fintan. And though she never relented in her search for him up and down the coasts of Ireland, she never found him again. And so, consumed in grief and despair, Cesair too fell ill and passed away. And her people raised a cairn to commemorate her, the first person to set foot on Ireland. But what of her ambition? Had she brought her people to safety? Had she delivered them from the murderous flood of the god of that Noah? Well, we can debate on another day whether he was actually a god or not. Interesting question. I mean, his arms were long, that is attested. Floodwaters did indeed rise against the island of Ireland. And there are people who will tell you that this would-be God's wrath was inescapable and that all of Cesair's followers perished after all. But you know what? Honestly speaking, it's bollocks. So those people should know better. Because if you speak to the people of Ireland today, you will find, I'm sure, that this theory is quite difficult to believe. Because does one not hear something of Cesair's legacy persisting in them? Some whisper of her world, or perhaps of her word. Perhaps in particular those not necessarily long words that she said to Noah when she told him what to do with his ark and his God and all ridiculous. Is it not more likely, we should ask, that the way of Cesair lives on? After all, their cairn to her still stands. And what sort of flood could trouble 49 of clearly the most formidable women of their time if it couldn't even knock over a pile of stones? Yeah? Oh. And what too of Fintan? Did he survive the cataclysm? Well, that one's another story, because in fact this was only the beginning of the legend of Fintan mac Bocra, as he's now known, Fintan the Wise. Because this story from which all other stories in Ireland follow,